He and others have argued that the Greeks decided that this was the best form of warfare, that it produced a sudden and sharp battle, and that was a good way of settling your quarrels because it avoided long drawn-out conflict. The decision for a kind of war, in fact, arose out of the democracy of the Greek city-states. This is John Keegan. The Greeks of the city-states were the first people on earth to contract between themselves as equals, to fight the enemy shoulder to shoulder without flinching from wounds, and not to yield the ground on which they fought until either the enemy had broken or they themselves lay dead where they stood. The idea of a connection between democracy and warfare, successful warfare, is very comforting. But styles of war arise out of brute circumstance. To fight with edged weapons, it's vital to fight at close quarters, unless the enemy runs away, which they do often enough. And you must fight in close order, because this provides the individual soldier with the physical and psychological assurance of the presence of his comrades. The Phalanx was not Greek. It was a very ancient formation. This is the so-called Steel of the Vultures of 2500 BC. It comes from the land of the two rivers. Bristling through this wall of shields, you can see there are spears. The spears of the holders at the front and of the men behind them. The carving implies a formation 9 men across in tightly packed files, 6 deep, precisely the formation which the Greeks adopted many centuries later. I think it's true that the Greeks developed the phalanx, normally 8 deep, and that they used it very effectively against the Persians. But it was not something they invented. It was something which they used because it was, across the ancient world, the obvious and most effective way in which people who had to fight on foot could fight. And the Greek phalanx has to be seen in the context of its world. But medieval armies also fought in phalanxes, and they knew the value of discipline on which the phalanx rests. The poverty of medieval states meant that they couldn't train, they lacked regular standing forces, and they relied very heavily on a different kind of phalanx, on the phalanx of the elite who had the discipline and the training to be very effective soldiers. It took a very long time before infantry emerged. The medieval knight, these are from the Bayeux Tapestry, the conquerors of England in 1066, was not a hoplite on horseback. This is a real hoplite. The discipline which underlies effective units like the phalanx was essentially very difficult to imbue because it depends on military organisation and the wealth to support armies. In the medieval world, they really didn't have that kind of discipline on a large scale because they didn't have that kind of wealth. They knew what they needed to do, but only in rare occasions could they produce really effective fighting units such as the phalanx in the hands of professionals had been. It's important to recognise that the European experience, which ultimately is the United States experience as well, in the Middle Ages, is not one of comforting superiority, nor can it be connected with the glories of a more distant and ancient past. In difficult times, reflective people look to a whole range of sources for ideas about the way through. And very often they look to the past for signposts and for reassurance. Rather obviously, we live in a world of war. In the 1990s, there was much talk after the collapse of the Soviet Union of the peace benefit, that we would all be able to beat swords into plowshares symbolically and enjoy a long-lasting peace. In fact, we now live in a more unstable and much more dangerous world than we lived in when Russia and America dominated the whole world. The notion that democracies are in some way suited to warfare, much retailed by Hansen, is a false assurance in our age of uncertainty. The notion of Western technological supremacy, implicit in the idea of a military revolution, is similarly an illusion, not least because the whole experience of high technology war since the 19th century, when it became a reality, is that weapons and technology leak. The FIM-92 Stinger, provided to the Afghans to fight the Russians in the 1980s, is now being used against US and NATO forces in that country. And the West has no monopoly on invention. Hezbollah deployed 4 aircraft drones, almost certainly of Iranian origin, to fight the Israeli attack in 2006. Associated with the military revolution is the notion of the triumph of the West. And what I've tried to show is that this triumph rested as much on chance political factors as on any supposed military skill or technological invention. World War II seems so close, and its military methods in a sense so familiar, that it appears to offer us great assurance. We won then, so we can win now. Hence my characterization of the Saving Private Ryan effect. But the truth is that the world has changed radically since 1945, and indeed since 1989. 1989 saw the end of the European dominance of the world. The Cold War was fought between 2 essentially European powers. The ideas of Marx and the Founding Fathers were all essentially European. It extended European supremacy, which had once rested on the world empires of Britain and France. But with the collapse of 1989, we live in a transformed world, which means that the ideas and values and methods of World War II have become deeply outmoded. The powers that we call Western are deeply challenged by economic development elsewhere, above all in China, and by new forms particularly of insurrectionary warfare, which we are finding very difficult to combat. I don't suggest that you can sit down and learn to pick your way through this very complex world that we live in by reading medieval military history books like my own or anybody else's. There are no guides. The past is not a simple guide to the future. But in a world perspective, it's worth remembering that Europe in the Middle Ages was faced by very much greater powers. European warfare in the Middle Ages was in itself pitiless and constant, often unsuccessful in competition with outside forces. It fell with peculiar savagery upon civilians, yet conclusive victory was uncommon and unsatisfactory, and ambivalent outcomes to war were quite usual. It was not a pretty world, but it is one which corresponds in its insecurity much more to the precarious situation in which we find ourselves, and it offers no spurious comfort, except the rather painful one that we survived, not always by very nice methods. In this sense, studying medieval history is something more than an academic pastime. And it matters, I think, a great deal that we should do it. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.